It is one of those peculiar coincidences of English weather that a wedding and a funeral should fall on the same day, and the skies weep for neither. The air was brisk but dry in the village of Bardsley Hollow, a charming corner of Hampshire where whispers carried farther than truth. And on this particular morning, two events unfolded within earshot of each other: the marriage of Mrs. Eliza Hayward, widow of the late Charles Hayward, and the discovery of a corpse on the edge of Thornwick Manor. Captain Arthur Hastings, recently returned from a sojourn in South America, found himself in attendance at the wedding, not for any particular affection for the bride, but out of courtesy to an old regimental comrade, Inspector Colin Venn. Venn, ever mindful of social graces, had invited Hastings along to meet the widow whose charms transcend tragedy. The good inspector, it seemed, had a weakness for local melodrama and a nose for gossip more than criminality. As the newly minted Mrs. Eliza Fortescue, her second husband, Benedict Fortescue, a man of mild intellect and impeccable tailoring, emerged from the chapel, murmurs rippled among the onlookers. She was radiant in ivory lace, a curious choice for a woman who had buried her first husband not 4 months ago. Her dark eyes, set deep beneath a polished brow, betrayed no hint of grief, only triumph, and perhaps, if one looked closely, calculation. It was as the wedding guests retired to Thornwick Manor for the reception that the housekeeper's scream shattered the spring morning. "They found a body," Venn muttered beside Hastings, his face darkening. "In the lake." The scene that awaited them was unmistakably English in its restraint. A young constable had drawn a makeshift curtain around the edge of the ornamental lake. A gardener stood by, pale and shaking, having been the unfortunate soul to make the discovery. The body had been pulled halfway onto the bank. Male, clothed in a grey suit now sodden and mud-streaked, his face unrecognizable but for the sharpness of the jaw, and a peculiar scar that curved like a question mark above one brow. "Eliza Hayward's first husband?" Hastings asked under his breath. "No," said Venn, peering closer. "Charles Hayward was buried properly in December. This man's younger, and not from around here by the looks of it." By noon, the wedding had unraveled into hushed confusion. The guests, trapped within the manor by both etiquette and circumstance, clutched teacups and whispered across the drawing-room. Eliza, ever composed, received condolences for a corpse yet unidentified with a poise that unsettled even Hastings. "I should like to call in a friend," Hastings said to Venn later that day, once the initial inquiries had revealed no identification on the body and no local connection. "He has a way of noticing things others do not." Venn gave a reluctant nod. "Hercule Poirot, I presume." And so it was that by the following morning, the legendary Belgian detective arrived in Bardsley Hollow by train, stepping onto the platform with his usual air of continental precision. Immaculately dressed in a dove-grey suit, his moustache waxed to perfection, he gave Hastings a nod and tapped his cane lightly as they made their way to Thornwick Manor. "Mon ami," said Poirot, "when you say that a body is found upon the estate of a woman newly remarried, formerly a widow, and that she greets death with calm instead of shock, I begin to suspect that something of interest awaits me." "Nothing's clear yet," Hastings said. "Only that the fellow wasn't a local and that Eliza Hayward, now Fortescue, seems untroubled." "Ah, but the calm in the face of death is either the mark of a philosopher or the hallmark of guilt." They arrived at Thornwick Manor, a Georgian pile surrounded by overgrown rose gardens and guarded by ivy. The house had once belonged to Charles Hayward, whose sudden death by heart failure had raised few questions, until now. Eliza received them in the drawing-room, dressed not in mourning black nor bridal white, but in a deep plum silk that caught the afternoon light. "Monsieur Poirot," she said with a half-smile, "so you are the gentleman sent to untangle what the local police find too distasteful." "I am here only to discover the truth, madame," Poirot replied, bowing. "Whether it is distasteful or delightful remains to be seen." Her laugh was delicate and practiced. Truth is a curious thing, monsieur. I've found it wears many faces. And some faces, Poirot said, tell lies better than the mouth. She offered tea, which Poirot declined. My husband will be down shortly, she said. He's not fond of all this unpleasantness, but I insist we be helpful. No one wishes to start a marriage in shadow. Poirot's gaze swept the room. And yet, madame, some shadows are cast long before the vows are spoken. Outside, the lake shimmered in the sun, deceptively peaceful, and somewhere beneath its surface, or perhaps already floating among the fragile ties of marriage, inheritance, and appearances, lay the first secret Poirot would unravel. For even as he sat sipping his chocolate in the guest quarters, he made a note to himself. Why did the widow marry so soon? And who, exactly, was the man in the lake? Poirot's methodical gaze swept the room as he listened intently to Mrs. Eliza Fortescue's soft words. She had settled into a chair opposite him, her posture poised and immaculate, yet there was something in the way her fingers twisted the lace of her handkerchief that hinted at a nervousness well hidden behind her practiced exterior. The conversation had faltered for only a moment before she regained her composure, smiling once again with the ease of someone accustomed to attention. Please, do not trouble yourself over the details of the investigation, she said, her voice almost musical in its ease. I am certain the police will be of great assistance. I simply wish to understand the circumstances of this dreadful discovery. Poirot inclined his head slightly, watching her as though she were an intricate puzzle piece yet to be placed in its proper context. Indeed, madam, it is the circumstances of such discoveries that most require explanation. A man, unknown, dead upon your estate, the body found near the lake, and yet the first husband, Charles Hayward, was said to have passed from natural causes. And now, it seems, death is visiting again. A momentary flicker of tension passed over her face before she leaned back, letting her hands rest elegantly on her lap. The timing of it all is most distressing. It certainly casts a shadow upon my wedding day, does it not? Her tone was light, almost dismissive, as though the true weight of the discovery did not sit heavily upon her shoulders. Poirot's gaze sharpened. It is most curious, yes. But you are untroubled, madame. Why is that? Eliza's smile never faltered, though there was a shift in her eyes, a brief wariness. I do not find it productive to indulge in unnecessary speculation, Monsieur Poirot. Let the authorities do their work. Poirot's lips curled slightly as he glanced at Hastings, who had been standing by the window, quietly observing. His expression was neutral, but there was a glimmer of suspicion in his eyes. Poirot nodded once, signaling that Hastings should continue his observations elsewhere. As the room fell silent, Poirot remained seated, his fingers tapping gently against the armrest of his chair. The silence stretched, but Eliza did not break it. She had learned the art of waiting, of allowing others to speak first. She was accustomed to maintaining control of situations, to shaping perceptions. Poirot's presence, his methodical calm, clearly unsettled her. Finally he spoke, his voice low, yet piercing in its precision. You say it casts a shadow upon your wedding day, madame, but what of your first husband, Mr. Hayward? How did he die? Was it natural causes? A shadow seemed to pass over her face, though it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Yes, she said with a quiet firmness. He was ill for some time. Heart failure. It was all very sudden, of course. Poirot studied her intently, noting the slight hesitation in her words, the precision with which she spoke. It was not the hesitation of someone speaking under duress, but of someone who had long rehearsed a response. And no one found it curious that he passed so suddenly. A man, no longer young but not yet old, in the prime of life, without warning. Her eyes flickered for a moment, but she composed herself almost immediately. The practiced composure of a woman who had faced far worse questions in the past. What are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot? I am suggesting, madame, that there is always more to a death than what meets the eye. You, madame, seem untroubled by the prospect of another death upon your property. Your first husband, so sudden in his passing, and now this man, unknown. It raises questions, does it not? Eliza remained silent for a long moment, her lips pressed together as though weighing her next words carefully. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, watching her closely. She was hiding something. He could feel it. There was more to this widow than she was letting on. Before she could respond, the door opened, and a tall man with sandy hair and a face marked by a recent evening of indulgence stepped into the room. Benedict Fortescue, her new husband, had arrived, his gait slow and deliberate, as though he were trying to settle into the role of the grieving spouse. His clothes were impeccable, though his eyes betrayed a certain unease. Unlike his bride, who wore her composure like armor, he seemed perpetually aware of the weight of the situation. "Poirot," Fortescue said, his voice a shade too smooth. "I trust you are finding everything satisfactory. It is most distressing, what has happened." Poirot nodded politely. "It is distressing indeed, Monsieur Fortescue, but I am sure you are aware of the importance of every detail." Fortescue's smile was tight, a flash of teeth too quick to be genuine. "Of course, we must leave no stone unturned." His eyes flickered toward his wife as though seeking her approval. "I'm certain the police will get to the bottom of this quickly. After all, it's just an unfortunate accident." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Is it, monsieur, an accident?" Fortescue's gaze faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "What else could it be? A drowning, perhaps, or some unfortunate incident?" Poirot's sharp mind caught the faintest of tremors in Fortescue's voice, an imperceptible crack in the polished veneer of his affability. "Indeed, monsieur, but we shall see." As the two men exchanged glances, Eliza rose from her seat, her movements fluid and elegant. "Perhaps it is time to attend to the guests, Benedict. They must be wondering about our next steps." "Of course, my dear," he said quickly, offering her his arm. Poirot stood as well, his eyes tracking the couple's movements. "One last thing, madame," he said, his voice measured. "Where was your husband last night at the time of the discovery?" Eliza's smile faltered for a split second, but she recovered swiftly. "Benedict was with me," she said smoothly. "We were together all night." "I see," Poirot replied, his voice cold and calculating. "And what of your guest, the late Mr. Hayward? His body was found close to your estate, yet no one seems to know who he was. Might I speak with the gardener who made the discovery?" Eliza's composure never wavered. "Of course. But as I said, it is likely nothing more than an accident." Poirot nodded curtly. "We shall see, madame. We shall see." As Eliza and Benedict Fortescue left the room, their movements synchronized, Poirot turned to Hastings, who had rejoined him after a brief survey of the estate. "This is no accident, mon ami," Poirot said softly. "There is a game being played here, a game of concealment, of appearances, of lies." Hastings, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "You think she knows more than she's letting on?" Poirot's gaze was distant, his mind already assembling the pieces of the puzzle. "She knows everything, mon ami, but not all is as it seems. The answers lie not in what is said, but in what is not. The game has only just begun." As the door to the drawing-room clicked shut behind them, the sound of distant chatter from the reception began to fade. But Poirot's mind was already far ahead, piecing together the subtle threads of this intricate mystery. The widow, her new husband, the mysterious corpse by the lake. Each had a role to play, and Poirot was determined to learn the truth beneath the layers of deception. Poirot and Hastings stood silently in the drawing-room, the soft murmur of the reception filtering through the walls. The elegant furnishings, the rich floral arrangements, the scent of fresh tea and pastries. Everything about Thornwick Manor screamed wealth and refinement. a stark contrast to the dark mystery lurking beneath its surface. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the door through which Eliza and Benedict Fortescue had just exited. He was deep in thought, his mind working through the many contradictions that had already arisen. "Mon ami," Poirot said after a moment, his voice low and deliberate. "We have been presented with many faces, but it is not the faces that interest me. It is the truth hidden behind them." Hastings, though less inclined to read into subtleties, could feel the shift in the air. Poirot was close. He could sense it in the way his friend observed the smallest of gestures, the faintest of hesitations. It was a rare thing for Poirot to speak so openly about his thinking before the case had been fully formed, but something about this particular situation had him intrigued. "The Fortescues are certainly an interesting pair," Hastings remarked, pacing by the window. "Eliza, with her icy composure, and Benedict, who seems to be putting on a show of concern. Do you think they're hiding something?" Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as if trying to peel back layers of a carefully constructed facade. "They are, my friend. But it is not only they who are hiding something. The truth lies in the unknown. The body by the lake, the unknown man. It is not an accident, Hastings. The answers are buried within the contradictions, and there is one contradiction that stands out more than the others." Hastings turned, intrigued by the sudden intensity in Poirot's tone. "What contradiction?" Poirot raised his hand, as though he were composing the puzzle in his mind. "Eliza's marriage to Benedict. The timing is too perfect, too calculated." "Calculated?" Hastings repeated. "I thought she was a widow, mourning the sudden death of her first husband." "Exactly," Poirot replied, his voice soft with understanding. "But widowhood is not always an honest shield, Hastings. Sometimes it is a carefully constructed mask. What is the quickest way for a widow to shield herself from suspicion? Remarry. The public will focus on the new marriage, the new husband, the new life. They will forget the past, the first husband, the inheritance, the potential motives." Hastings' brow furrowed. "But Benedict, he seems genuine. He doesn't strike me as a man capable of hiding such depths." Poirot smiled, a slow, knowing smile that reflected a glint of something more than just logic. "Ah, Hastings, my dear friend, you see only what you are meant to see. Benedict Fortescue is an actor, a player in this drama, and like all actors, he knows how to play his part. He plays the concerned husband, the devoted man. But behind the mask, there are cracks, small but telling, and the cracks are where the truth hides." Hastings wasn't entirely convinced, but he had learned over the years to trust Poirot's instincts. "So what now, Poirot?" "We will speak with the gardener," Poirot said, straightening his suit and moving towards the door. "The one who discovered the body, he may have seen something, or someone, that the others have overlooked." As they made their way down the long corridor towards the back of the house, Hastings couldn't help but notice how different the atmosphere felt from just a few hours ago. The guests were still milling about in the reception hall, but there was an undercurrent of unease now that hadn't been there before. The joy of the wedding had evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable tension. Poirot, on the other hand, seemed untouched by it, his mind entirely focused on the task at hand. Outside, the garden was quiet, the soft hum of nature the only sound to accompany their steps. The gardener, a burly man in his 50s with calloused hands and a weathered face, was tending to the flower beds near the back of the property. He looked up as Poirot and Hastings approached, his eyes momentarily flickering with uncertainty. "Mr. Thomas, I believe?" Poirot inquired, his voice polite yet commanding. "Yes, sir," the gardener answered, wiping his hands on his trousers. "What can I do for you, Mr. Poirot?" "We understand you discovered the body by the lake this morning. Please, tell me everything you saw." Thomas hesitated, his gaze shifting nervously as if the memory of the body still troubled him. "Aye, well, it weren't a pretty sight, that's for sure. I was just coming down to water the plants when I saw him. The man just there, half in the water like. Had you seen him before? Poirot asked, his tone gentle but insistent. The gardener shook his head. No, sir. He was a stranger to me. I didn't recognize him. Did you notice anything unusual? Any sounds, any movement in the area before you found him? Thomas thought for a moment, scratching his chin. Well, now that you mention it, sir, there was something odd. I heard footsteps, heavy ones, coming from the direction of the house. I didn't see who it was, mind you, but they were there, just before I found the body. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And did you see anyone leave the area after that? Or any carriages, perhaps? Thomas shook his head. No, sir, I didn't. It was just the footsteps, like I said. And then I found him, but I'm not sure what to make of it, sir. Poirot's mind raced, quickly sifting through the details. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps. That could be important. Hastings, who had been observing the exchange quietly, stepped forward. You didn't see anything else? No sign of struggle? Nothing to indicate how he might have ended up in the lake? No, sir, Thomas replied, his voice firm. The body was just there, floating like. Poirot stood still for a moment, deep in thought. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Your information is valuable. As they walked back toward the house, Hastings couldn't help but ask the question that had been on his mind since they first heard about the body. Poirot, do you think this man was murdered? If so, why leave him by the lake? Why not hide him? Poirot's eyes gleamed with a mixture of curiosity and resolve. A good question, Hastings. But you see, the placement of the body tells us something important. It is not hidden, nor is it meant to be. It is a statement. Someone wanted the body to be found, wanted it to be seen. But why, Hastings? Why leave it in the open? Hastings was silent for a moment, trying to piece together the significance. Do you think it's tied to the widow? Poirot's lips curled into a small smile. It is too early to say, my friend. But one thing is certain. The widow's alibi is much more complicated than it first appears, and the mystery of the dead man by the lake is only the beginning of a much larger puzzle. The two men turned back toward the manor, the evening drawing near and the soft murmur of voices from the reception growing faint in the distance. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to fit together, just as Poirot had known they would. But for now, he kept his thoughts to himself, knowing that the true test lay ahead. The answers would come, and when they did, the face of the widow would reveal more than she had ever intended. For now, however, there was one thing he could say with certainty. The game had begun, and Poirot, with his little grey cells, was ready to win it. The following morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered softly through the windows of Poirot's temporary quarters, but the detective was already awake. His mind, restless and sharp, had not allowed him a moment's peace since he had returned to his room the previous evening. The body by the lake, the mysterious stranger, the cryptic steps, each piece of the puzzle lingered in his thoughts, demanding to be solved. There was something about the case that stirred his intuition, something beyond the initial appearances of a mere accidental drowning. Poirot's mind was a whirlwind of deduction. Eliza Fortescue's icy demeanor, her sudden marriage to a man like Benedict, who was far more concerned with appearances than truth. Each detail was being catalogued, cross-referenced, and examined. Yet a question nagged at the back of his mind. Why had the murderer, if there indeed was one, left the body so conspicuously by the lake? Why not dispose of it more discreetly? The answer to this riddle seemed just out of reach, like a fleeting shadow that vanished the moment he tried to grasp it. As Poirot adjusted his immaculate bow tie and prepared to join Hastings for breakfast, a gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice steady and calm. The door opened to reveal a familiar figure, Inspector Grange, the local officer who had been overseeing the initial stages of the investigation. Grange was a competent man, but he lacked the flair for deduction that Poirot had come to expect from the greatest minds in his profession. Nevertheless, Poirot had learned to trust Granger's straightforward nature, even if he did not possess the same level of psychological insight. "Ah, Inspector, good morning," Poirot said, rising to greet him. "What brings you to my humble quarters this fine morning?" Grange looked unusually tense, his face drawn with concern. "I'm afraid there's been a new development, sir. A letter has arrived at Thornwick Manor, an anonymous note written in a hurried hand. I thought you'd want to see it straight away." Poirot's interest piqued. He motioned for Grange to sit. "Let us see this letter, then. It might provide a new clue, an unexpected piece of the puzzle." Grange handed over a small envelope, its paper thick and textured. Poirot took it carefully, opening it with precise movements. The letter inside was brief, but it carried an undeniable weight. "To the one who seeks the truth," it began. "The widow is not the innocent she appears to be. The key lies in the past, and the lake is but a symbol. Look to the past, and you will find the answer." Poirot read the note twice, his lips curling into a smile as he handed it back to Grange. "A most curious letter. It seems someone knows more than they are letting on." "What does it mean, Poirot?" Grange asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. Poirot's gaze was distant, his mind already working through the implications. "The widow, you see, is at the heart of this mystery, but the past, yes, it is the past that holds the key. The lake, the body, the mysterious man. It is all tied together in a way that none of us have yet fully understood." He paused, thinking for a moment before his eyes sharpened with sudden clarity. "Inspector Grange, I believe we must speak with Eliza Fortescue once more. But this time, we must look beyond her outward composure and focus on the subtle details, the things she has overlooked, the things she believes are insignificant. You see, the truth is often hidden in plain sight, like a thread waiting to be pulled." Grange, though still uncertain about Poirot's approach, nodded. "I'll have her brought in, if you think it's necessary." "It is more than necessary, Inspector," Poirot replied. "It is crucial. We must understand her connection to the past, her relationship with her first husband, and why she sought to bury it beneath this new marriage. Only then will we truly understand her motives and the motive of whoever sent that letter." The two men set out for the drawing-room, where Eliza Fortescue was waiting, her posture as perfect as ever, her face a mask of controlled composure. She rose as they entered, offering them both a cool nod of acknowledgement. "Mr. Poirot, Inspector," she said, her voice as smooth as silk. "What brings you here this morning?" Poirot studied her carefully. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her eyes that intrigued him, the way they flickered ever so slightly when she spoke, as if she were hiding something beneath the surface. The widow's composure was impressive, but Poirot had learned long ago that appearances were often the most dangerous lies. "Madame Fortescue," Poirot began, his voice polite but firm, "we would like to ask you a few more questions. It is about your late husband and the circumstances surrounding his death." Eliza's expression did not change, but Poirot could see the slight tightening of her jaw, the minute increase in her breathing. A subtle shift, but it was enough. Hastings, ever watchful, also noted the change, though he said nothing. "I've already told you everything I know about my husband's death," Eliza replied, her voice cool and controlled. "It was a tragic accident, and I see no reason to dwell on it further." Poirot smiled gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "Ah, but that is where we differ, madame. For I believe that what you see as an accident is, in fact, a carefully constructed narrative, and I believe that your marriage to Mr. Benedict Fortescue may be a crucial part of that narrative." Eliza's eyes hardened, but she did not falter. "I fail to see how my marriage to Benedict is relevant to the investigation into the death of my first husband." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "You see, madame, the truth often lies not in what is spoken, but in what is unsaid. The connection between your late husband, your marriage to Benedict, and the events surrounding that letter. It is all a carefully woven web, and I intend to unravel it. For the first time, Eliza's composed facade cracked just the slightest bit. A flicker of something, was it fear, flashed across her face. Poirot could see it, but he did not mention it. Instead, he pressed on. You see, Madame Fortescue, your first husband's death was not as accidental as you have led us to believe. There are too many inconsistencies in your story, too many unexplained gaps. And as for your second marriage, well, let us just say that it is the perfect shield, is it not? A widow remarrying quickly, so that no one will think to question the past. Eliza stood motionless, her gaze cold. You have no evidence to support these accusations, Mr. Poirot. You cannot just— I do not need evidence, Poirot interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I need only the truth, which I will find, no matter how deeply it is buried. Eliza's face remained expressionless, but Poirot could see the slightest tremor in her hands, her fingers twitching just enough to betray her calm exterior. His mind raced, quickly connecting the dots. Tell me, Madame, Poirot said, his voice now soft and coaxing. Have you ever truly mourned your first husband, or was his death, in fact, something much more convenient? Eliza's lips parted as if to respond, but she stopped herself. A flicker of uncertainty passed across her face, and for a split second, Poirot could see the true extent of her fear. She was hiding something far deeper than he had anticipated, and the key to the entire mystery was closer than ever. Eliza Fortescue stood before Poirot, her posture rigid, her fingers now tightly clasped in front of her. The brief flicker of unease he had witnessed moments earlier was gone, replaced once again by a cold, controlled exterior. Yet Poirot knew better than to be deceived by such an act. The tremor in her hands had spoken louder than any carefully chosen words. There was something she was hiding, something that connected her past to her present in a way she was desperate to keep buried. Madame, Poirot said, his voice gentle but insistent, you must understand that I do not accuse you lightly. I only seek to uncover the truth behind your first husband's death, and what truly lies beneath your second marriage. Eliza's eyes narrowed, but she remained silent, her lips pressed tight. It was clear to Poirot that she was weighing her options, deciding how much she was willing to reveal. A moment passed, heavy with tension, before she finally spoke. My first husband's death was a tragic accident, she repeated, her voice betraying the faintest hint of weariness. What more do you wish to know? It was a boating accident. He was never a strong swimmer, and the weather that day turned suddenly. He fell into the lake, and by the time help arrived, it was too late. Poirot tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. Yes, I recall your version of the story. But tell me, Madame Fortescue, when did you and Mr. Benedict Fortescue first meet? I understand you were not married long before he passed away. Eliza's gaze flickered momentarily, but she quickly regained her composure. Benedict and I knew each other for several years before we married, she replied evenly. Our families had been acquainted for some time. After my husband's death, it seemed natural for us to move forward. It was a difficult time, and Benedict was a great comfort to me. Comfort, Poirot repeated, his eyes now piercing into hers. Or perhaps a convenient arrangement. A man who quickly steps into the role of protector, of husband, in the wake of tragedy. A man whose connections and wealth could shield you from the whispers that surely followed your first husband's untimely demise. Eliza stiffened, her eyes flashing with barely concealed anger. I did not need to be protected from anyone, Mr. Poirot. My life has been my own, and I have made my own choices. Choices, Poirot mused. But sometimes one makes choices to hide what cannot be explained. Perhaps it is not so much the future you are seeking in your marriage to Mr. Fortescue, but a way to bury the past, a past that you believed would never resurface. Her silence spoke volumes. Poirot did not need to press further. The clues were there, wrapped in her words, her reactions, the way she held herself in the face of his deductions. The widow's marriage to Benedict Fortescue had been a strategic one, perhaps even a necessary one. But what was it she feared so deeply? What part of her first husband's death was so uncomfortable that she would go to such lengths to conceal it? Madame Fortescue, Poirot continued, his voice quiet but insistent. I believe you are trying to protect someone or something. Perhaps you are trying to protect your own guilt. The past you seek to bury may not be so easily forgotten. She opened her mouth as though to argue, but the words died in her throat. Her gaze dropped for a fleeting moment, and in that instant, Poirot saw it. A flicker of fear, a shadow of something much deeper than simple regret. It was the same look he had seen in the eyes of those who had committed crimes they were too ashamed to confess. He had seen it 1,000 times before, but it always felt fresh, always felt like the first time. "Do you believe I killed my first husband, Mr. Poirot?" Eliza asked suddenly, her voice colder than before, but the tremor of anxiety still present. Poirot leaned forward slightly, studying her closely. "I do not believe, Madame Fortescue. I deduce. And what I deduce is that you are hiding something far more complicated than an accidental drowning." There was a long pause, the only sound the steady ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of unspoken words. Then, slowly, Eliza lifted her chin and met Poirot's gaze directly. "You are right about one thing, Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice now steady. "My first husband's death was not as it seemed, but I did not kill him. He died because of his own recklessness, because of his own choices." Poirot nodded, as though he had expected no less. "And yet you would rather let the world believe it was an accident than let the truth come to light. Why, madame? What is it that you fear?" Eliza remained silent, her eyes now distant, as if she were looking beyond Poirot, beyond the room itself, to a place he could not follow. Poirot's sharp gaze never wavered, his mind already piecing together the fragments she had provided. "Fear is an interesting thing, is it not?" Poirot continued, his voice almost a whisper. "It compels us to do things we never thought we were capable of. It twists our actions, forces us to lie, to deceive, and sometimes to even kill. But the truth, Madame Fortescue, always finds a way to reveal itself, no matter how much we try to bury it." Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. Poirot, watching her with an intensity that never faltered, knew she was on the verge of breaking, of revealing whatever it was that had haunted her for so long. Before Eliza could speak, there was a sudden knock on the door, cutting through the tension in the room. Poirot looked toward Grange, who had entered without waiting for an invitation. His face was pale, his eyes wide with urgency. "Mr. Poirot, there's been another incident," Grange said, his voice strained. "A second death, at Thornwick Manor." Poirot's heart quickened, though his expression remained calm. "A second death?" he echoed. "Who has died, Inspector?" Grange's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's Mr. Benedict Fortescue. He was found in the library. It looks like..." "Like what?" Poirot asked sharply, his mind already racing ahead. "Like he was poisoned, Mr. Poirot." The words hung in the air, and Poirot felt a chill run down his spine. A second death, just hours after their conversation. And if Benedict Fortescue had been murdered, it could only mean one thing. Someone in this house was a killer, and the widow's secrets were far darker than anyone had imagined. "Prepare yourself, Inspector," Poirot said, his tone final and resolute. "We must return to Thornwick Manor at once. This mystery has taken a new turn, and I believe we are closer to the truth than ever before." The journey back to Thornwick Manor was swift and silent. The motor car cut through the damp countryside, headlights glowing dimly in the mist that had rolled in with the evening. Poirot sat upright in the rear seat, his gloved hands folded neatly in his lap, his gaze distant yet sharp. Beside him, Inspector Grange kept glancing out the window, as if half expecting to see the spectre of Benedict Fortescue among the trees. When they arrived, the house was cloaked in unnatural stillness. A footman met them at the door, pale and shaken, leading them wordlessly through the echoing halls to the library. The door had been left ajar, and the scent of cigars, leather-bound books, and something faintly acrid met them as they entered. Poirot's sharp eyes took in the scene immediately. Benedict Fortescue lay slumped in a leather armchair near the hearth, a half-finished glass of port on the side table beside him. His complexion was pallid, tinged slightly blue around the lips. There was no sign of a struggle, no obvious wound. Just a man who had apparently passed peacefully from life into death. But Poirot, with his acute eye for human detail, sensed otherwise. Dr. Rowntree, the local physician, rose from where he had been examining the body. He removed his spectacles and gave a brief nod. "Very likely poison," he said gravely, "although it's too early to say which kind. There are no visible injuries. No sign of cardiac arrest. He may have drunk something laced, perhaps even the port itself." Poirot moved to the glass and sniffed it delicately. He did not taste. He never relied on physical tests when human behavior would tell him more. He merely noted the faint almond bitterness mingled with the deep aroma of fortified wine. "You suspect cyanide, Doctor?" Poirot asked softly. Rowntree gave a hesitant nod. "Possibly, but we'll know more once the post-mortem is performed." Poirot turned his gaze to the gathered faces at the threshold. Mrs. Clemency Harper, still dressed for dinner, clutched a handkerchief to her mouth as she stared, stricken. Geoffrey Lavery, the solicitor, stood pale and unreadable. Cyril Marsh looked bewildered, as though the death of Benedict Fortescue had overturned some internal equilibrium. And near the back, nearly hidden in the shadows, stood Eliza. She had changed. Her hair was no longer perfectly styled, her dress no longer pristine. There was something raw about her now, stripped of artifice. She looked not like a widow for the second time, but like a woman who had spent her life waiting for a ghost to return, only to be left with the corpse of her own silence. Poirot addressed them collectively, his tone grave. "No one is to leave the house. I shall require statements from each of you. Mademoiselle Harper, were you present in the library earlier this evening?" Clemency shook her head quickly. No, I was in the music room with Cyril. We were rehearsing something, a Mendelssohn duet. Geoffrey was there too. He came in briefly to talk about some paperwork for Benedict." "Indeed." Poirot's gaze shifted to Lavery. "I was only there for 5 minutes, the solicitor said, his voice clipped. "I left shortly after. Benedict was still in the dining room when I saw him. I didn't come into the library." "And you, Mr. Marsh?" Cyril rubbed the back of his neck, clearly unsettled. Yes, I was with Clemency. I didn't even know Benedict had come in here. He usually reads before bed." "And you, Madame Fortescue?" All eyes turned to Eliza. "I was in my rooms," she said, her voice hoarse. "I hadn't seen Benedict since earlier this afternoon." Poirot studied her for a moment, then turned to Grange. "Have the staff been questioned?" "We've started," Grange replied. "The butler saw Mr. Fortescue enter the library around 10. No one else was reported in or out afterward. The housemaid who cleaned earlier said nothing seemed amiss." Poirot walked slowly about the room, not touching anything, but examining every detail. A book lay on the table, spine cracked, The Psychology of Guilt. A curious choice. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "You see, mes amis," he said quietly, "the difficulty in such cases is not the method, but the motive. Poison, especially cyanide, is no weapon of opportunity. It must be planned, prepared, administered with care, and above all, it must be given by someone the victim trusted." He turned his gaze again to the widow. "Tell me, Madame Fortescue, did your husband drink port every evening?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. He claimed it helped him sleep." "And did he always pour it himself?" Her brow creased slightly. "Most nights. But the bottle is kept here in the cabinet. He might have poured it earlier and returned later to drink it." Poirot examined the decanter. It was half full. He lifted it delicately, holding it up to the light. The color was slightly off. Not enough to raise the suspicion of a casual eye. But Poirot was no casual observer. He turned back to Eliza. "Was this port served at dinner?" "No," she said quietly. "Benedict never served this one to guests. It was a private indulgence." Poirot gave a slow, thoughtful nod. Then his eyes swept once more across the assembled faces. Someone knew his habits. Knew he would come here after dinner, take his port alone, perhaps with a book. Someone who knew the precise moment to act. This was not a crime of chance. It was a crime of intimate knowledge. Geoffrey Lavery stepped forward, irritation creeping into his tone. "Surely you're not suggesting that one of us—" Poirot raised a hand. "I suggest nothing. I deduce. And what I deduce is this. Mr. Fortescue did not die at random. His death was tied to something far older than a single evening's malice. There is a pattern. First, a man drowned in mysterious circumstances. Now his successor poisoned. Madame Fortescue has lost 2 husbands in as many years." "You think I did this?" Eliza's voice rang out suddenly, cutting through the room. Poirot did not answer directly. Instead, he walked slowly to the fireplace and stood looking down at the logs, glowing faintly beneath a charred grate. "I think, madame, that you have not yet told the truth. Not about your first husband, not about Mr. Fortescue, but I also think," he turned back to the others, "that she is not the only one concealing something. There are lies here. Lies that begin not with murder, but with love, with resentment, with inheritance, perhaps even with betrayal." A heavy silence fell. Poirot turned to Grange. "We shall require access to the guest lists from Eliza's first wedding, also the police report from her first husband's drowning. It was in Lake Windermere, I believe." Grange nodded. "I'll have it requested at once." Poirot's gaze lingered once more on the widow. "Madame, I would ask you to remain at Thornwick. I do not believe you are in danger, but others may be." Then he addressed the room. "The truth is here. It sits in this house like a shadow, thin, silent, waiting to be seen. But Hercule Poirot sees all, and soon, mes amis, it will be exposed." He walked to the doorway, pausing only to glance back once more at Benedict Fortescue's still form. A man who married a widow may have believed he understood her past, but perhaps it was not her past he married, but her alibi. The following days unfolded in a haze of tension, with Poirot quietly observing the family and staff as though the house itself were an intricate puzzle awaiting his mastery. The post-mortem report had arrived, confirming the presence of cyanide in Benedict Fortescue's blood, but there was little else to go on. No sign of a struggle, no obvious motive, and certainly no weapon in sight. The authorities were no closer to finding a breakthrough than when Poirot had first arrived, but he knew better than to be swayed by appearances. He had his suspicions, but the truth was far more complex than a simple murder. One afternoon, as Poirot sat in his study, the door creaked open and Inspector Grange entered, holding a file of documents in his hands. His face was grim, the lines of weariness etched deeper than usual. "I've got those reports you asked for," Grange said, placing the file on the desk before Poirot. "I contacted Windermere. The drowning, as you suspected, was never fully investigated. It was ruled an accident. The first husband's name was Philip Danvers. He'd been a financier, well known in society." Poirot took the file, leafing through it slowly. The details of Philip Danvers' death were vague, almost dismissively so. A boating accident. A man lost at sea in the dead of night. No witnesses, no investigation of his wife's behavior at the time, no attempt to dig deeper. The drowning had been an unfortunate accident, a tragedy, not a crime. Poirot closed the file and looked up at Grange. "And did you find anything else? Anything at all?" "Nothing that points directly to foul play," Grange admitted. "But I did look into Danvers' estate. It's worth mentioning that Eliza was named sole beneficiary. She inherited everything, properties, investments, everything." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Quite a large sum of money, I presume." "A very large sum," Grange confirmed. "He was worth a great deal. His fortune was substantial, but it was tied up in certain investments that required management. The whole thing has been in Eliza's hands ever since." Poirot stood up, pushing his chair back with deliberate care. "And now we look at the pattern, Inspector. One man drowned, and now another is poisoned. Both of them had wealth, significant wealth, and both were married to the same woman. It's too convenient to be dismissed as coincidence." Grange nodded slowly. "You think she had something to do with her first husband's death?" "I think it is highly probable," Poirot said, his voice calm but firm. "What we are dealing with here, Inspector, is not a simple widow who has lost 2 husbands. No. This is the work of someone who understands exactly how to manipulate their circumstances, how to bend fate to their will. Eliza Fortescue had everything to gain from both deaths." The silence that followed was thick, the weight of Poirot's words settling like an invisible hand on the shoulders of the 2 men. Grange broke it with a deep sigh. "But what about the second murder?" he asked. "Benedict Fortescue wasn't exactly a man of great fortune. His estate wasn't nearly as large as Danvers." Poirot's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "Aha. That, my dear Inspector, is the key. Benedict Fortescue wasn't the end goal. He was merely the means. The question we must ask ourselves is not why Eliza would want him dead, but why she needed him in the first place." Grange stared at him, the realization dawning slowly. "You mean—" "Exactly," Poirot said. "Fortescue was not the source of wealth she sought. No. But he had something far more valuable. Connections, influence, a reputation that would shield her, protect her from any suspicion. She married him to gain access to those very things. And after she had them," Grange murmured, "he became expendable." Poirot gave a single, curt nod. "Precisely. And the motive for his murder was not personal hatred, but cold calculation. Eliza's inheritance from Philip Danvers was still tied up, her assets frozen. Fortescue's death, however, would open new avenues for her, financial and social. With him gone, she would be able to access his wealth, position herself in such a way that no one would question her role as the grieving widow. The poison, you see, was not the act of an emotional woman, but of a woman who was thinking several steps ahead." Grange walked to the window and looked out at the foggy grounds. "So, you think Eliza did it?" "I do not believe, Inspector, that the woman we are speaking of is a grieving widow," Poirot said, his voice low and measured. "She is someone who has learned how to wear grief like a comfortable coat. Someone who understands how to use it to her advantage. She has created an alibi for herself, not only in the eyes of the law, but also in the eyes of society." "Then who's our next step?" Grange asked. Poirot looked toward the door. "We must find out more about the guests at Thornwick Manor. There is one detail we have overlooked. Who knew about Eliza's first marriage? Who knew about her past? I suspect there are more secrets hidden in this house than we have yet uncovered." Later that afternoon, Poirot gathered everyone in the drawing room once more, the tension palpable in the air. He studied each person's face in turn. Clemency Harper, Geoffrey Lavery, Cyril Marsh, and finally, Eliza herself. Her eyes were defiant, but Poirot saw beneath that exterior the cracks in her composure. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice calm but firm. "I've been investigating not only the deaths of 2 men, but also the nature of trust. You see, one must understand that the very foundation of trust is built upon knowledge. Knowledge of what is seen and what is hidden. And I am here to tell you, the truth lies hidden beneath the veil of your actions." Clemency Harper shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twisting in her lap. "What do you mean?" Poirot's eyes were sharp. "You, Mademoiselle Harper, were close to Mr. Fortescue. But did you know he was married once before? Did you know of his late wife, the woman he had abandoned for his second marriage?" Clemency's face turned pale, but she remained silent. Poirot's gaze moved to Geoffrey Lavery. "And you, Monsieur Lavery, when did you first meet Benedict Fortescue? Was it before or after his marriage to Eliza?" Lavery stiffened. "I met him after, of course. After he married her." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "That is an interesting response, Monsieur Lavery. But your answer carries with it the weight of something untold, something you would rather not say." Lavery's mouth tightened into a thin line. Poirot's gaze moved to Eliza. "And Madame Fortescue, I have one final question for you. What did you know of your late husband's first wife? What connection did she have to your second marriage? And perhaps, just perhaps, you can explain to me why you never told anyone of her existence until now?" Eliza's gaze faltered, her composure slipping ever so slightly. But Poirot raised a hand, cutting her off. "Do not rush, madame. The truth will come in its own time, and it is that time which draws near." The room fell silent, the weight of Poirot's words settling heavily over them. The silence in the room thickened as Poirot's gaze held steady on Eliza Fortescue, who had noticeably tensed under the weight of his pointed questions. For a brief moment, she seemed to hesitate, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features before she composed herself once more, her lips pressing into a firm line. The other guests in the room, too, seemed to feel the palpable tension, their eyes shifting nervously between Poirot and the widow. But no one spoke. Eliza finally broke the silence, though her voice was tight, strained. "I do not know what you are insinuating, Monsieur Poirot. Madame, please." Poirot interrupted with his characteristic calm, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "I only ask questions. The answers you provide are for you to decide." He paused for a moment, letting his words linger. "You see, the truth is never far from the surface, but sometimes it takes the right questions to make it rise." There was a long, uncomfortable pause before Eliza spoke again, but this time her words were softer, almost hesitant. "I knew of Benedict's first wife, but she was long gone by the time I met him. She had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and I never thought to speak of her again. It seemed irrelevant." "Disappeared?" Poirot's tone sharpened, his interest piqued. "Tell me, Madame Fortescue, when exactly did she disappear, and what were the circumstances?" Eliza shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing momentarily toward the windows as if searching for an escape. "It was years ago, before Benedict and I even knew each other. I didn't know all the details, but I do know she went missing in a boating accident. The authorities believe she drowned, just like Philip Danvers. The body was never found. They called it an accident and never pursued it further." Poirot leaned forward ever so slightly, the smallest of frowns curling his lips. "An accident," he murmured, the word lingering on his tongue. "You say it was an accident, but do you believe that to be true, madame?" Eliza faltered, and Poirot could see the uncertainty in her eyes now. For the first time since the investigation had begun, her usual composure seemed to crack, even if only slightly. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Her admission was the moment Poirot had been waiting for. He knew it wasn't the answer, but it was the crack in her facade he needed. As Eliza shifted uneasily in her seat, her body language speaking volumes, Poirot turned to the others in the room. "Let us examine this carefully, mes amis," Poirot continued, his tone thoughtful but firm. "We have two deaths tied together by a series of coincidences. First, a drowning, then a poisoning. Both involve a widow who has something to gain from the deaths of her husbands." His eyes flicked briefly to Eliza, who stiffened. "And yet, we are told that these deaths are accidents, mere happenstance. But I do not believe in coincidences, nor do I believe in accidents when the truth is so clearly hidden." Geoffrey Lavery, who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat. "But what does that mean, Poirot? Are you suggesting that Eliza—" "Oui," Poirot replied, his eyes narrowing with precision. "I suggest that Eliza Fortescue is at the center of a complex web of deception. But the true question is not whether she killed Benedict Fortescue. It is why. Why would a woman of her stature, so poised, so carefully calculating, risk everything for a man who had so little to offer compared to her first husband?" The room fell silent once more as Poirot's words echoed in their minds. Lavery shifted, visibly uncomfortable, while Clemency Harper sat up straighter, her eyes flicking between Poirot and the widow. Eliza, for her part, had gone quiet again, her eyes dropping to her hands in her lap. Poirot took a deep breath before continuing. "Madame, you claim to have no part in this, no knowledge of what truly transpired with your first husband, and yet I'm inclined to think that the events surrounding his death are not as simple as they seem. You, Madame Fortescue, have not been entirely truthful with us." "You have no right," Eliza began, her voice rising in defense. Poirot raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I have every right, Madame. For you see, there is a reason I am here. You are not just a widow. You are a woman with something to hide, a past that cannot remain buried forever." His words cut through the air, and for a moment it felt as if the very walls of the room were closing in on Eliza. She swallowed hard, and the tension in her posture deepened. She began, then faltered, the weight of the moment pressing on her. "I have been in your shoes before," Poirot said softly, his voice suddenly more personal. "I have seen what it is like to hide the truth, to run from the past, but you must understand, Madame Fortescue, that the truth does not stay hidden forever. It always comes to light." A long silence followed, and for a moment no one spoke. Then, with a resigned sigh, Eliza finally lifted her gaze to meet Poirot's. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of defiance and something else. Something darker, perhaps regret. "I did not kill him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I may as well have. I was a part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. I don't know what happened, but the second I met Benedict, I knew my life was going to change." Poirot leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Tell me everything, Madame. Every detail." Eliza closed her eyes as if bracing herself. "I'd been married to Philip Danvers for years when we met. He was powerful, wealthy, but distant. He didn't care for me. Never did. But then I met Benedict. He was different. He paid attention to me. He understood me in a way that Philip never did, and I thought I'd found a way out. But then Philip's death happened so suddenly, and Benedict was there. He offered me his name, his protection. I didn't want to lose that, so I accepted it." "But you never spoke of your first husband's death," Poirot interrupted, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Why is that?" I couldn't. I feared what people might think. I feared that someone might suspect me of being involved, of orchestrating it all. So I kept quiet, and then, when Benedict died, well, I didn't know who to trust anymore." "And yet," Poirot said, a glimmer of understanding dawning in his eyes, "you stayed silent all this time. Why? Why stay in a marriage with a man who never truly loved you?" Eliza's eyes darkened, a sad, knowing smile curling at her lips. "Because, Monsieur Poirot, it was never about love. It was always about survival." Poirot sat back, processing her words in silence. There it was, the heart of the matter. Eliza had never sought love. She had only sought protection. But protection from what? From whom? The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The motive, the method, the careful deception. But the true story was far from over. Poirot sat quietly for a moment, his piercing gaze fixed upon Eliza Fortescue, as if silently weighing her every word. The silence stretched on, but it was not uncomfortable. It was merely the calm before the inevitable storm of revelation. Each word she had spoken, each fragment of truth, was a thread pulling him ever closer to the heart of this twisted web. Yet there was still more to be uncovered. The pieces, though close to fitting, had yet to align completely. "Survival," Poirot finally said, his voice low and contemplative. "It is a powerful motivator, madame. You sought protection from Philip and then from Benedict. But what of the others, the other players in this delicate charade?" Eliza's gaze faltered for a moment, as if his words had struck a chord deeper than she cared to admit. She swallowed, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. I don't know what you mean. The others? The others who have been part of this story. Those who may have known more than they let on, Poirot said, his voice smooth and deliberate. The ones who have been complicit, whether knowingly or unknowingly. A murderer does not act in isolation. There are always accomplices. Always. The widow's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing for a long while, the faintest tremor running through her fingers. Then she spoke, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Geoffrey Lavery," she muttered. Poirot leaned forward. "Ah, the man who offered to help you after your husband's death. What role does he play in all of this?" Eliza shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. "I don't know how much he knew. I truly don't, but he was there. He was always there when Benedict was too busy with other matters. I don't know if he wanted something from me, or if he was just trying to protect his own interests. But I never trusted him fully." "And yet you kept him close," Poirot said, his voice barely a murmur, but the weight of it was undeniable. "I didn't know who to trust, Poirot," she replied sharply. "When Benedict died, it was as if everything I'd built was crumbling, and then Geoffrey was the only one left who seemed to care." Poirot regarded her for a moment longer before nodding slowly. "Yes, you have made your choices. But now, it is time for the truth to come out. The game is not yet over." He turned his attention to the others in the room. Clemency Harper, who had been watching this exchange with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Geoffrey Lavery, who had become even more tense since the conversation had shifted to him, and the rest of the guests, each of them suspecting that they were being pulled deeper into the mystery. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, awaiting Poirot's next move. Poirot's mind was working furiously. Eliza Fortescue had given him a key piece of the puzzle, but it was not enough. There was still something missing, a crucial detail that had yet to surface. Something that linked the death of Benedict Fortescue to the larger story. Something more than just a widow, seeking protection. And then it hit him. Something he had overlooked earlier, a detail that now stood out with stark clarity. He turned back to Eliza, his gaze more intense than before. "Madame Fortescue, you have been very forthcoming with me, and I thank you for that. But there is one thing you have yet to tell me, something that has been troubling me since the beginning, the matter of the will." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "The will," she repeated, almost too quickly. "Yes," Poirot replied, his voice steady. "When Benedict died, it was said that he had left his fortune to you, but what of the rest of his estate? The business, the investments? You see, madame, there is a detail that has not yet been addressed. The question of what Benedict Fortescue truly left behind. Was it a fortune, or was there something more hidden?" Eliza's expression faltered, a brief but unmistakable hint of fear in her eyes. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she looked toward Geoffrey, who seemed to stiffen under her gaze. Poirot did not miss this subtle exchange. He turned his attention to Lavery. "Monsieur Lavery," he said calmly, "you have been unusually quiet. Tell me, what do you know of Benedict's will?" Lavery's eyes darted nervously, his fingers twitching as though he were searching for an escape. I don't know anything about it. Nothing, Poirot." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You are certain of that, monsieur?" Lavery swallowed, his discomfort palpable. Yes. I've told you everything I know. There's nothing more." "Nothing more," Poirot repeated, his voice soft but insistent. "You see, Monsieur Lavery, that is where I believe you are mistaken. You know more than you are letting on." Lavery stiffened, but before he could respond, Poirot turned back to Eliza, his voice cutting through the tension. "Madame Fortescue, I must ask you one final question. The day Benedict died, did you know that he was going to make changes to his will?" Eliza's face was a study in confusion, but Poirot could see the subtle shift in her demeanor. She was caught. She had never fully anticipated this line of questioning. I don't know. He never told me." Poirot smiled faintly, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "No, I do not believe that. You see, Madame Fortescue, Benedict Fortescue did not simply die. He was murdered, but his death was not about money or revenge. It was about something far more valuable. Information." At this, the room fell silent once again. Every eye was on Poirot now, and he allowed the moment to stretch, the suspense thickening. "Benedict Fortescue," Poirot continued, "was about to expose a scandal, something that would have ruined many people, including you, Madame Fortescue. And that, I believe, is why you sought to eliminate him. Not for the money, not for the power, but to protect yourself from the ruin that his revelations would have caused." Eliza's face drained of color as the realization hit her. The truth was now fully in the open, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. Her gaze flitted to Geoffrey Lavery, who was now looking at her with a mixture of fear and something darker, something that suggested complicity. Poirot's eyes softened for a moment as he looked at the widow, but his voice was unyielding. "The game, as you say, is over, madame, and it is time for the truth to come to light." As the room fell into an uneasy silence, Poirot stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. The weight of the revelation had settled in the air, thick with the unspoken tension of what was about to unfold. The game had reached its end, but the final act was yet to be written. Poirot's eyes remained fixed on Eliza Fortescue, her body rigid as though the revelation had physically struck her. Her lips trembled, her carefully composed facade beginning to crack under the weight of the truth that had finally been exposed. The room was still, the silence almost deafening. Everyone, from the curious Clemency Harper to the tense Geoffrey Lavery, seemed to hold their breath as though they instinctively knew the end was near, and yet none of them dared to interrupt the quiet storm of Poirot's steady observations. Eliza's gaze flickered from Poirot to the others in the room, before settling on Geoffrey, whose face had gone pale, his posture now stiff with anxiety. He seemed to shrink back, almost as though he wanted to melt into the shadows, but Poirot's eyes never left him. There was a fear in Lavery's eyes, a desperation that spoke volumes without a word being uttered. His involuntary glance toward the door only confirmed what Poirot already suspected. Lavery knew he was caught in the net, and the instinct to flee was hard to suppress. "The truth, Madame Fortescue," Poirot said softly, his tone almost a whisper, "is more than just a matter of money, or even power. It is a matter of survival. You sought to protect yourself. Yes, to protect your future from the ruin Benedict would have caused had his scandalous revelations seen the light of day." Eliza's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment her eyes darted toward Geoffrey again, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. Poirot could see the internal struggle she was facing, the battle between admitting the truth and clinging to the last vestiges of the carefully constructed narrative she had built around her husband's death. "But it is not just you, is it?" Poirot continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "No, there is another involved in this. One who is far too eager to protect you, Monsieur Levery." Geoffrey shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting around the room like a caged animal searching for an escape. Poirot's sharp eyes missed nothing, noticing the subtle changes in Lavery's expression, the quick intake of breath, the clenching of his fists at his sides. It was as if the man had already resigned himself to the inevitable confrontation. "Geoffrey Lavery," Poirot said, his voice growing firm, "you have been a part of this story from the very beginning. You who acted as the concerned friend, the helpful companion, the one who wanted to ensure the widow's safety. But your actions speak louder than your words, do they not?" Lavery's lips parted, but no words came out at first. He swallowed hard, his eyes flicking nervously toward Eliza, who was now staring at him with a mixture of betrayal and fear. "It was not just a matter of loyalty, was it, Monsieur Lavery?" Poirot pressed, his voice now taking on the calm, methodical cadence of someone who was watching a puzzle fall into place. "You had your own reasons for keeping Eliza close, reasons far more selfish than a mere desire to protect her." Lavery's face paled further, and his gaze finally shifted to the floor, as though the weight of Poirot's scrutiny had become too much for him to bear. The truth had indeed been too much to conceal for so long. He opened his mouth, but still no words came. Poirot's eyes softened briefly, the detective within him momentarily giving way to the realization that this was no ordinary case. This was more than a simple murder. It was a psychological battle, one that had involved manipulation, deception, and a fear that had ultimately driven both Eliza and Geoffrey to the edge. "You knew, Monsieur Lavery," Poirot said, his voice softer now, almost as if speaking to himself. "You knew what Benedict had uncovered, what his last days had been spent investigating. You knew that he had discovered the truth about you, about your involvement with the financial discrepancies at the heart of the Fortescue estate. You knew that if Benedict went public with his findings, your entire career would have been ruined." Geoffrey looked up sharply, his face now flushed with a mixture of anger and panic. "I don't know what you're talking about," he spat, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Oh, but I believe you do, Monsieur Lavery," Poirot countered, his gaze never wavering. "You had the most to lose when Benedict's investigation came to light, and so, when you learned that he was about to reveal everything, you acted swiftly, murderously." Lavery recoiled, but Poirot's calm demeanor did not falter. He had known from the very beginning that the murder was not just a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. No, it was a calculated move, the final step in a plan that had been set in motion long before Benedict's untimely death. "The murder," Poirot continued, his voice low and steady, "was not only to prevent Benedict from exposing the truth, it was to eliminate the risk you faced, to protect your financial interests, and, of course, your secret." Lavery's mouth worked as though he were searching for the right words, but none came. His attempts at defending himself were futile. Poirot had laid the case out too clearly. Every piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and now there was no escape for him. Eliza, too, seemed to understand that the game was over. Her eyes, once filled with defiance and anger, now looked hollow, as though the weight of everything she had done and everything she had hidden was finally coming home to roost. "And you, Madame Fortescue," Poirot said, his eyes returning to her, "you knew exactly what Geoffrey Lavery was capable of. You may have thought you were in control of him, but in truth you were the pawn in his game. His desire to protect you, to get close to you, was driven by his own interests." Eliza's lips parted, but she said nothing. She seemed to shrink under the weight of Poirot's deductions, as though the truth had finally shattered the protective shell she had built around herself. "You made your choices," Poirot continued, his gaze unwavering, "and now you must live with them. The truth will come out, and you will both face the consequences of your actions." For a moment, there was only silence. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension almost palpable. Poirot allowed the quiet to settle in, savoring the feeling of the puzzle being solved, each final detail slipping into place like a key turning in a lock. "Do not think, either of you," Poirot said at last, his voice calm but firm, "that this is the end of your troubles. There is more to this story than you realize, more that will come to light in due time, but as for now, you will both face the consequences of your deeds. It is only a matter of time." He stood up, his composure unshaken, and turned toward the door. As he did, his eyes flicked to the others in the room, Clemency, who was watching this all unfold with wide eyes, and the other guests, all of whom had been drawn into this labyrinth of deception. "And as for me," Poirot said, a slight smile curling his lips, "I am content to let justice run its course. The little grey cells, you see, never fail me." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving the room in stunned silence, knowing that the storm of revelations had only just begun. Poirot stepped into the cool air of the hallway, his thoughts a tangle of clarity and calculation. He could feel the weight of the room behind him, a suffocating tension that had only grown heavier with the truth now exposed. But he knew there was more to this, more that had yet to be uncovered. The confession, however reluctantly made, had been the first crack in the facade. There were still lingering questions, small but significant details that had not yet found their place in the grand scheme of the case. His mind turned over the pieces, piecing together the fragments of conversation, behavior, and the subtle, often overlooked interactions between the suspects. Eliza Fortescue's smooth exterior had been cracked. Yes, but only partially. There was still something about her, a lingering sense that her role in this affair was more complex than just the passive pawn she had seemed to be. Geoffrey Lavery, on the other hand, had shown his true colors, his desperation, his feigned helplessness. It had all been part of a larger game. Poirot had seen it in his eyes, the quick glances, the instinctive shifts in his posture. Lavery had known too much, and his motive was too carefully calculated. Still, there was something about him that didn't entirely add up, something that poked at Poirot's mind like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. He walked down the corridor, his footsteps light and measured. His hand brushed lightly against the banister as he moved, his thoughts in constant motion, racing ahead of him as if chasing the shadows of a truth that was still elusive. It was only when he reached the study, the door slightly ajar, that Poirot paused. The dim light filtered through the crack in the door, casting a shadow across the polished wood floor. Inside, Clemency Harper sat at the desk, her back to the door, her hand hovering over the papers spread before her. Poirot could see the slight tremble in her fingers, the nervousness she had tried to hide behind a calm facade. He knocked softly, the sound barely audible, but enough to pull her from her reverie. She straightened immediately, though there was no denying the tightness in her posture as she turned toward him. "Monsieur Poirot," she greeted him, her voice calm but not quite steady. I didn't expect you." But I had hoped I would catch you before you left," Poirot replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "There is still much to be understood, mademoiselle." Clemency's lips parted, and for a moment her eyes darted to the door as though she were contemplating an escape. But she remained seated, her hands folding over each other on the desk as though to anchor herself. I don't know what more I can tell you," she said, her voice soft, but tinged with an undercurrent of something deeper, something hiding just beneath the surface. "Everything I've said is the truth." Poirot tilted his head slightly, studying her as though she were a puzzle he was still working to solve. He had watched her carefully throughout the evening, noting her every word, her every gesture. She had been the perfect picture of calm, almost too perfect, the kind of calm that hid anxiety beneath it, a calm that was often built on lies. "You were quite fond of Eliza Fortescue, I suspect?" Poirot began, his voice gentle, almost conversational. "She has been your friend for many years, yes?" Clemency nodded, her lips pressed together in a tight line. "Yes. We grew up together. She was my closest friend, my confidant. But she is not your only friend, is she?" Poirot continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "You and Mr. Lavery, you share a connection, do you not?" The slight flush that rose in Clemency's cheeks was all the confirmation Poirot needed. He could see the subtle shift in her expression, the way her eyes darkened for a moment, a fleeting emotion that passed as quickly as it had come. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, the words slipping out a little too quickly, too sharply. Poirot smiled, a smile that reached only his lips, his eyes remaining steady and unyielding. "Ah, but I believe you do, mademoiselle. You and Monsieur Lavery, you share a history. It is not just Eliza you have been protecting, it is him." Clemency's hand tightened on the desk, her knuckles whitening. "You have no right to suggest—" "Ah, but it is the truth, is it not?" Poirot's voice was quiet, but firm, cutting through her protests. "You are not just a mere friend of Eliza's, mademoiselle. You were involved in her affairs, and you knew more than you let on. You knew that she had her reasons for marrying, but you also knew that those reasons were not as simple as they appeared." Clemency's eyes flickered, and Poirot could see the walls she'd carefully constructed around herself begin to crumble. "Geoffrey Lavery," Poirot said again, his voice soft but insistent. "He was more than a mere confidant. You and he, there was something between you, wasn't there?" The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the weight of the truth that Clemency had been keeping so carefully hidden. Slowly, she nodded, her shoulders sagging as though the admission itself was a weight she could no longer carry. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. We were involved, but I didn't kill Benedict. I swear it." Poirot's gaze softened ever so slightly. "I never said you did, mademoiselle. But you did know that there was more to this than simply a woman trying to protect her inheritance. You knew about Benedict's investigation, you knew about the financial scandal, and you knew about the people who were trying to protect their secrets." Her eyes met his then, and in them Poirot saw something, an admission, but not one of guilt. There was a sadness, a regret, and perhaps even a touch of fear, but there was no defiance. She had been caught in a web of lies and half-truths, and now the truth was unraveling around her. "You are correct, Monsieur Poirot," Clemency said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she had been holding back. I knew everything." Poirot gave a small nod, his expression thoughtful. "And yet you did nothing. You remained silent, watching as others made their moves. Why?" Clemency's lips parted, but no sound came out. She seemed to shrink into herself, her head bowed as though she were ashamed. "Because I was afraid," she said softly. "Afraid of what would happen if the truth came out. Afraid of what Geoffrey would do if it all unraveled." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "But you were not the only one afraid. Were you, mademoiselle?" The realization hit her like a cold wave. She looked up sharply, her eyes widening. "You think—" "I think," Poirot said gently, "that there are more secrets here than just the ones you and Monsieur Lavery are hiding. The truth, mademoiselle, is much more complicated than any of us could have imagined." Clemency's gaze fixed on the floor, the weight of her thoughts pressing heavily upon her. Poirot could almost see the internal struggle playing out in her mind. She was caught between the past and the present, the choices she had made and the consequences now bearing down on her. He watched her carefully, his eyes sharp, waiting for the moment when the full picture would finally fall into place. She would speak again, he knew. It was only a matter of time. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint sound of her breath. which had become shallow and uneven. Clemency's fingers twitched on the edge of the desk, and then, almost as though the words had been forced from her, she spoke. "I never meant for any of this to happen, Monsieur Poirot, but you must understand it was never supposed to go this far." She lifted her head, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, though her voice remained steady. I never wanted Benedict to be murdered." Poirot said nothing, allowing her to continue at her own pace. He knew better than to rush her. Patience was his most effective weapon. Clemency's story would unravel in its own time. "When Geoffrey and I—" she faltered, her words caught in the air, then pushed forward. "When we first met, it was nothing more than a fleeting connection, a shared interest, perhaps. But over time it grew into something else. A need to be together. We made plans, secret plans, to secure our future, to have everything we wanted without interference." She closed her eyes for a moment, as though trying to block out the memory. But it was too late. "And Benedict?" Poirot prompted, his tone soft but insistent. Clemency swallowed hard. "Benedict stood in our way. He was too clever, too determined to dig into things he didn't belong in. He knew about the financial discrepancies, the shady deals that Geoffrey had been involved in. He started asking questions, poking around. I told Geoffrey that we had to silence him before it all came to light, but Geoffrey couldn't do it. Not by himself." She paused, a small, bitter laugh escaping her lips. "He needed help. He needed someone who wasn't as obvious as he was. He needed me." Poirot's sharp mind snapped to the implications of her words. "So, you did help him?" Clemency nodded, her eyes darkening. "Yes, I helped him. But it wasn't just about protecting Geoffrey. It was about protecting myself too. The things I knew, the things I had allowed myself to be part of. If they came out, I would lose everything." "And Benedict?" Poirot asked again, pressing further. "I never thought it would go as far as it did," she whispered. "At first, I thought we could just scare him, get him to back off, to drop the investigation. But he wouldn't. He was relentless. I don't know when it changed, when Geoffrey became so desperate. But the night Benedict was killed, Geoffrey, he was panicked. He came to me and I—" She broke off, her face twisting in anguish. "I didn't know what to do. It was too late to stop him. The moment we decided to end it, we sealed our fate." Poirot stood still, his gaze fixed on Clemency, who had once again dropped her eyes to the desk, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. Her story was unfolding piece by piece, and each new revelation was as damning as the last. But even as the pieces clicked into place, Poirot could sense something subtle yet distinct, that was still not quite right. There was more to this. He could feel it. "The question now, mademoiselle," Poirot said slowly, his voice gaining weight, "is not whether you and Monsieur Laverie were involved in Benedict's death. No, it is clear that you were. The real question is why." Clemency's head snapped up, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Why?" Poirot's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Why kill Benedict at all? Why go through all this trouble? Surely your financial future was secured. You had the protection of your family's name, and you were not without means. But there was something more, something deeper that pushed you to make such a drastic decision." For the first time, Clemency seemed to falter in her thoughts. Her face flushed, and for a brief, intense moment, Poirot saw her struggle to maintain composure. It was as though the weight of her own guilt had momentarily overwhelmed her, and she didn't have the strength to hold it back any longer. Clemency began, then paused, her voice catching in her throat. "I wanted to be free. I wanted to be free from all of it, the expectations, the constraints. I wanted to be with Geoffrey, truly with him, without fear or consequences. But when Benedict started digging, when he wouldn't stop, I feared that everything would unravel and that my life would be torn apart. Poirot stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "But you see, mademoiselle, the truth is that your fear was not of Benedict exposing you. It was the fear of losing Geoffrey. You did not kill Benedict simply to protect yourself. You killed him because you feared Geoffrey's own involvement would come to light. You killed him to keep the man you loved from losing everything." Clemency stared at him, her eyes widening as though something had clicked in her mind. It was the truth, one she had been avoiding, refusing to confront until now. "But it wasn't just Geoffrey, was it?" Poirot's voice was barely above a whisper now, but it was as sharp as ever. "You feared the consequences, not just for Geoffrey, but for yourself. You knew that if Benedict uncovered the truth, you would be exposed. It was never about love. It was about survival. The survival of your carefully constructed life." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not look away. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, it was. I was trying to protect us." Poirot nodded, a soft expression of understanding crossing his features. He could see it now, the fragility of Clemency's world, the desperation that had led her to make the unthinkable choice. "It was not just about saving Geoffrey," Poirot continued, "but about saving yourself. And in doing so, you condemned Benedict, a man who knew too much and was too stubborn to back down." There was silence in the room for a long moment as Clemency absorbed his words. Finally she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Poirot studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small, imperceptible shake of his head. "It is too late for apologies, mademoiselle," he said softly, his eyes lingering on hers for a moment before he turned and walked toward the door. "The truth has been uncovered. The consequences must now be faced." As he left the room, Poirot could feel the weight of the case lifting from his shoulders, but he knew that justice was never as simple as uncovering the truth. In the end, Clemency would have to face what she had done, and her life would never be the same. But for now, Poirot could allow himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The mystery had been solved. And as always, justice would find its way.